What's your I finally met my online friend horror story? Met this dude on EverQuest and we've played games together ever since. Been a part of the same guild. Help each other out on mobile games. And have conversations about life in general. It isn't him that's the horror story. It was his mom. So one day. I think we were playing WoW at the time. I log on to do some quests. Suddenly his user comes on and asks to chat by video. We've done this before and there's no problem, but after I click to start the video chat, there's his mom butt naked on the screen. She asks me to watch her masturbate and I'm like, no lady, this is just awkward F, and I log off for a few days. I get an email from my friend and he wants to know why I haven't shown up for quests or anything. So I tell him what happened and he is seriously like, WTF. Turns out his mom had been doing this to a lot of his online buddies and she eventually goes to prison for raping a minor or two. Buddy's doing great though. Wife and kids, plus we still play the occasional game together. I never actually met the guy, but spoke to him on the phone. We met on MySpace when I was in college and exchanged email addresses when we realized we lived in the same town. Eventually, I gave him my phone number and made plans for him to call me. When he did, his voice creeped me out. It was how I imagined a serial killer would sound. By the time I got past it and was comfortable talking to him on the phone, I started noticing other red flags. Whenever I brought the neighborhood up, he changed the subject. At one point, I asked him what his favorite restaurant on the boulevard was and he hedged. So I made up a restaurant that I said was my favorite. He immediately said that was his favorite too and that he especially loved one of their dishes. He went on and on about this wonderful place that didn't exist, and there wasn't a similar one in town. So he couldn't be confused. I called him out on the fact that he'd obviously never been to my neighborhood. Turned out, he didn't even live in the same state as me. A guy in a forum for a specific hobby would talk to me a lot, but never revealed his real identity. Until out of the blue he suddenly asked me to please come to see him in hospital, where he died a few weeks later. When I was younger I met an online friend in a public place for the first time. He was about my age and hadn't lied about that. So I guess I'll let my guard down. Anyway, after we walked for a while I noticed he had led me down a dark alley with no other people. He then looked at me and said how he really wanted to pay me right then and there. Right after he'd said that, my instinct kicked in, and I ran as fast as I've ever run in my life. Until I came to the train station. Here I jumped on the first train I saw and got the hell away from him. I met a guy online. We really got on and he came over a few times so we could hang out. I did find him attractive and tried to hint that I was into him. Note: I can't flirt to save my life, but nothing ever happened. After a few dates he suddenly vanished offline. No social media. He wasn't answering texts or emails. Nothing. I thought he'd ghosted me. After 6 months he reappears. I asked him where he'd been and he said I don't want to talk about it. A few weeks after, there was a fad where people were googling their names and posting humorous stories they had found about similar people with their name. Mine was about a ship that had my initials. And I started to Google friends' names just out of boredom, morbid curiosity. Googled his name and found a local news story from his area. One of those crime and courts things that he had been done for statutory pay of a minor. Online grooming and had his computer and phone seized as evidence. You dodge a big bullet. Said he was 14. Turns out he was 38. My parents gave him a stern talking to. Edit. Everyone is saying how he was a child molester and all that, but let me clear thing up. He was always nice and friendly online until I found his Facebook and saw his age. At which my parents had a mental breakdown. Was never allowed to play video games with him online again. Edit II. Born on a leap year obviously. After 4+ years of playing WoW together and chatting, online and on the phone, he invited me to visit him in Australia. I figured it was safe. Since I'd known him for quite a while and had never gotten any weird vibes, no flirtation, no creepiness, nothing. 2 days into my very clearly stated platonic visit, he tried to pay me. I ditched all of my stuff except what I had in a small duffel bag and took off, traveling on my own for the 2 weeks until my flight home. A few months later, I received an unsigned postcard from the Gold Coast that just said, "Thinking of you," with a smiley face. I used to play a war game and I was friends with this other person, was a guy, and we became good friends and talked and all. Then out of the blue he asked me to be his girlfriend. He was a truck driver in the USA and I was only 12. It freaked me out a lot and I ghosted him. It was a terrifying experience and a real eye-opener for me. We were friends online for years. We'd meet up every so often, and when we started families we'd meet up and take the kids to the zoos or whatever. She wanted us to go on a cruise together with our husbands and kids. I made the comments towards the effect of, "We can't afford that." And she went nuts. "We shouldn't have had kids if we can't afford them. We shouldn't have more children. Our life sucks blah blah blah," because I didn't want to go on a goddamn cruise with her and her bratty ass kid. Sounds like a nightmare. I love how "we can't afford a cruise" turned into "you can't afford your whole life. You irresponsible pleb." Back in about 1998, I met someone playing an online word game. We were both 16-year-old girls and we just hit it off and became very close. Finally in 2004 she was passing though where I live, so I invited her to stay for a few days. She shows up totally coked up. Then she invites some guy over and they were snorting cocaine off her car key in my living room. I didn't know she used coke and I was so uncomfortable the entire time. It was like having a stranger there. Yet we knew everything about each other. We remained in touch and I still really like her, but it was just such an awkward visit. We haven't seen each other since. Oh. Edit. I met a really cool group of people from a chat group website called Zat that lives in minimal distance away from me, like maybe 15 minutes, and the horror story part is that I was in my emo phase and probably made a great lasting impact on their lives as a hot topic connoisseur. He was driving cross country with a friend. I said I had a couch floor they could crash on if needed. He was great. She was an annoying bitch. She hated everything. Was annoyed by my cat. Didn't like anything I had to eat or drink, etc. They were literally there for like 16 hours. Not a horror story, but about a year after I made the move from Massachusetts to South Carolina, I was playing video games and a guy on my team talked about how he just moved into a house in the same area that I moved from. So I PM'd him and turns out that he moved into my old place and was playing in my old room with his desk in the same spot I had mine. I'd been chatting to a girl for quite some time and finally ended up visiting her house about 50 miles away for an evening of enjoying each other's company. We wake up the next morning to loud noises, which turned out to be her fiance I knew nothing about, ripping a window off its hinges and climbing in as she'd locked him out, locked the door and left the key in the lock, and there was a strange car on the driveway. So he thought she might be in trouble. Alas, it was me in trouble, as this guy was huge and a bit upset by this point. I managed to talk him down and explained the situation, to then find she had called the police and accused him of breaking and entering. During the time the police were questioning him, I made my escape and hightailed it out of there. I mean, it was okay for a while, but I ended up having to leave his house and take a bus in the middle of the night to a hotel because he was upset that I wouldn't kiss him or sleep with him and that I called him toxic for trying to get me to. Didn't happen to me, but a good friend of mine when I was living in Oregon around few years ago. He had an older sister who met some random guy from the East Coast online and were constantly chatting. After some time they developed feelings for each other and he decides to move cross country in order to marry her. The issue was she was 26, didn't have a job and was still living in her parents' house. He was incredibly lazy, a slob, never graduated high school and also couldn't keep a job to save his own life. But since she is lonely and insecure, she accepts and continue living in their parents' house to this day. We were both in our early teens and had already met in person one time before at a public event. We decided to meet up again, but at her house this time. In the short span of time I was over there, I watched her physically attack her mom and bust a door. I mean, I was already aware of some home problems, but I was not prepared to get caught up in the middle of it immediately. This was about 16 years ago. I, 26F, was talking to a guy online and we were calling each other back and forth. He lived in NJ and I lived in Mass. We finally decided to meet, so he drove up here from New Jersey. My friend was working at a laundromat at the time, so I decided it was a safe place for us to meet there. After hours of waiting, he pulled into the parking lot in an old beat-up car with all his belongings in the backseat, and he looked about 50 years old. He was pretty scary and I was pretty freaked out. I guess he thought he was moving in, which was no way happening as I had a roommate. What he told me on the phone, he was a few years older than me and I never saw a picture. I guess I was very trusting because everything he told me, I believed. Good thing I decided to meet him last minute in a public place. I had to tell him that I was not interested and he needed to leave that night. That was such a bad situation. In my early teens, my friend and I had online girlfriends who we spoke to for about 6 months before finally deciding to meet up. We met at a theme park, so it was all in public as we were worried it would turn out to be some weirdos or something. Turns out they were exactly as their photos suggested and were genuine. The problem was that me and my friend, after saying hello, were too shy to say anything to them. We spent the rest of the day with them, queuing for rides together, not saying a word. It was such an awkward experience. We kept in contact with them for a while afterwards but decided never to meet again. I had a layover in Amsterdam and I met up with a buddy I'd been chatting with on Soulseek for years, electronic music file sharing. He gave me directions to his work. He delivered a huge wheel of cheese to a church in the red light district, then got drunk and high in a bar. 10/10 most Dutch experience possible in Amsterdam. Only horror show part was how tall Dutch people are and how they speak English. The guy was like 6'7" and his voice was high to match. And all loopy and sing-songy. Very hard to take seriously as a person. RuneScape. My sister and I made a friend. He was super chill and once my whole neighborhood got together and started playing, we all came to know this guy and exchanged phone numbers. He called me a few times, usually asking about quests. Specifically, I remember him asking about Silverlight. He loved close by, so he visited us a few times via bike. But we always hung out outside, so our parents never really met him. Well, one of my neighborhood friend's parents found out and flipped the out. This was during that whole every online friend is a predator phase. They refused to believe that we were all the same age. These parents told everyone else's parents and everyone, including me, got grounded from the computer for months. My dad interrogated our online friend over the phone and threatened him. Then concluded that he was in fact the same age as us and not a 40-year-old man with a voice changer because his parents got into an argument with my dad. It was a total show. Not my story, but the one where a 14-year-old boy posed as a 15-year-old girl on Tinder to bait a pedophile. When the pedophile showed up, he kicked his ass while dressed up like Spider-Man. That's not a horror story. Kind of opposite, but I like telling it. Met a guy on Tumblr like years ago and ended up being FB and IG friends, but I'm from Michigan and he lives in Scotland. Eventually we started playing PC games together. One day we're playing PUBG and I said I think it'd be cool to go to Iceland. Well, we just said it and went. Coolest trip I've ever been on. I met someone from Trollks and we decided to meet up since we were in the same city. Went to a bar. Went for a walk. It was a good hangout. I told him about my latest Tinder date in which I drank too much. He goes on a passionate rant about how I need to be careful or I'll get ARPed. I'm like, WTF. He backtracks, saying years ago, before he transitioned to male, he got ARPed by a guy who he met on Tinder or something. I'm like, oh. Okay. I'm sorry. Understand. However, he proceeded to antagonize every single man I mention in passing. Up to and including my dad. I go to get on the bus and he shouts at me about being careful about ARPed. People turned around like, WTF. OMG. Yeah. We didn't hang out again. Got friendly with a guy I met in a chat room. After a year of chatting daily for longer and longer periods, we decided we really had to meet up. Everything was great. We met up for a weekend or so every month for the next year. Finally persuaded me to move in with him. I was besotted. I left a good job, a nice home, and the kind man I had been with for 20 years. Broke my mum's heart and moved 500 miles to be with him. Within weeks the physical abuse started, which got worse and worse. It was several years before I managed to escape, luckily with my life. But permanently semi-disabled and suffering PTSD, severe anxiety and depression. This guy, a mental health nurse, basically ruined my life. I was so stupid. You are not stupid. People like that are experts of manipulation and it's not easy to see or escape. I hope you are doing better. My girlfriend finally met her online friend and slept with him. Was playing Fortnite with some chick. She lived fairly local, so we decided to meet up with the intention of getting coffee and just chatting. As I was almost outside of a meeting place, she said, "Oh, by the way, I'm a bit big." I said, "No problem, it's fine." She walks out of the meeting place and I kid you not, dude, she was big. Again, not judging. Just wish I knew earlier. After Starbucks, she gets in the car and my poor car, dude. This is just a little Honda Civic, nothing too big. Anyway, before we get to Starbucks, she looks at me and is like, "So, coffee, right?" I said, "Yeah." Chat and whatnot, then out of nowhere she pulls her seat back as I am driving and said, "Well, maybe we can just skip coffee." Me, daddy, and I was like, what? Haha, and she repeats herself again and is basically trying to force herself and grab me. So yeah. No more Fortnite chicks. Not horror, but as a 13-14-year-old I used to meet boys off the internet all the time. Alone. Lying to my parents about where I was and going back to their houses. I went down to Stockholm to meet him. He was so tall. I felt myself nearly shrinking in intimidation and social anxiety. We're married and have been together since early 08. This makes me want online friends again. I matched with a girl on Tinder and we agreed to meet up at a nearby coffee shop. When I arrived, I was sitting in the parking lot and noticed only 2 people in the coffee shop. Some old guy and a girl who looked similar to the girl I matched with on Tinder. She didn't entirely look like the girl I matched with on Tinder, but she looked enough like her for me to pass it off as her using filters to make herself look better. I texted her that I'm here. When I did that, the old guy and the girl got their phones out at the same time and I got a text that said I'm inside. I went inside and went up to the girl and said, "Hey, Melissa, right?" She looked up from her phone, frowned up and said, "No. Wrong person." Right after she said that, the old guy tapped me on the shoulder. I turned, he gave me a toothy smile and casually said, "Howdy." I ran out like I was running from a killer. Not me. But my sister likes to do online dating or whatever. Well, she met this one guy who she liked and met. They dated and he even came to my and my husband's wedding. Randomly one night she ran away from home. Wouldn't answer her phone. House was unlocked. Stuff missing. When she finally contacted someone, it was my husband. The way she was texting didn't sound like her at all. She was never one to just openly say stuff like "I love you." When she started texting us, that's what she kept saying. I questioned it and she responded with saying that she just never said it enough. Keep in mind we only had text contact. Never heard her voice. Time went by, maybe few days, and she contacted our mother and said she was pregnant. Turned out that guy had knocked her up, convinced her to run away, verbally abused her, and tried to keep her from having any contact from us by trying to keep her phone away from her. One day she was able to get in contact with our mother and tell her to pick her up. Opposite of a horror story, but I joined a FB group for pregnant women, all with the same due date. We were from all over the world and got really close when trying to keep each other awake when we were all up all night with our newborns. I lost my job in 2015 and posted about it, and another woman said she was hiring for my same position. I met her in person for the first time for the interview. Flash forward 4 years and she's still my boss and one of my, now in real life, best friends. I've been promoted 3 times since I started thanks to her. We've traveled all over the world together for work, even did a beach pit stop in Fiji on the way home from New Zealand once. Anyway, I just feel like I wouldn't be where I am today if I hadn't taken a chance meeting a virtual stranger. I had an LDR online friend and when we met he RP'd me. That's mine. We bonded over Fanet. I was looking up to her because her art was, still is, vastly superior to mine. She visited me 2 years ago. Jumped on a plane and was just there one day. We had a pretty good time. Even though she was very introverted, so I had to use all my social powers to keep the convo going. The problem arose the moment when she confessed her attraction to me and asked to eat me out. I was dumbfounded to say the least. So I politely declined, saying that I wasn't into girls. I felt really bad. So we ended up making out anyway. We stayed in touch for a couple of months after her visit. Then she deleted all her accounts from our mutual social media. Met this guy online. Became best friends. Fell in love. Dated for a few years. Got married. To put it short, he visited me. We went out and got drunk. When I woke up he peed onto my couch while he was sleeping. Still a happier ending than like 90% of these. Horror story in the sense that I wish so much that I didn't finally meet him this way. My best friend of 14 years who I solely knew online passed away back in September. I found out the night after he passed when his mother messaged me and told me the news and passed along the info for his funeral. I live in California and he was in Chicago and I felt that it was my duty to finally go out there and see him. It was completely surreal and horrifying to finally see him in person. In a box. That being said though, I'm so glad I flew out there for his service and had the honor of being one of his pallbearers. I just wish we had met up a long time ago before this. My online friend of 10 years flew me out to meet up and we ended up having a huge fight and didn't talk for 2 years. Fight about what?